She'd been unable to forgive her for soaring alone over a boundary she herself could never bring herself to cross. Unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Young-hae, protagonist, to shuck off social constraints and leave her behind, still a prisoner. And before Young-hae had broken those bars, she'd never even known they were there. And to me, like the crux of the novel kind of like came together in that small realization. You don't really see that elsewhere. It's just a sort of grappling of why would she eat, what's happening, like her internally beginning to kind of transform herself for the first time, but nowhere near where her sister has become now. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Bookish, a casual book club. As always, I'm joined by my colleagues, Kofi Adiza, Laura Yu in the studio, and today we are talking about a novel called The Vegetarian by Han Kang. Kang was born in 1970 in South Korea, and in 1993 she made her literary debut as a poet and was first published as a novelist in 1994. So she has won several prizes. The Vegetarian won the Man Booker Prize, which is a highly prestigious international book prize. And listeners might recognize her name because she's most recently the Nobel Prize winner for literature and the first South Korean ever to win that particular prize. So we figured it might be a good time to revisit some of her work. I first read her book, The Vegetarian, like several years ago. I think maybe Laura you might have recommended that I read it. And it's one of those reading experiences where I remember so distinctly because I could not stop thinking about the book for days and days and days afterward. It was just like lingering with me. And so I reread it over the Thanksgiving break and came away with some new kind of insights, but also, again, same thing happened. You know, I remembered why it stuck with me for so long and how fascinated I was by what Kang was doing in the novel. So, you know, I was really looking forward to this episode, and especially since Kofi, you're a newcomer to her work.
I am very much a newcomer to her work.
So I'm curious. I'm going to start with you.
Oh, goody.
What you thought?
I've been anticipating this question.
Right.
What did I think?
Yeah.
I actually enjoyed reading it because it felt, even though the story was about a woman who makes what her family sees as a dramatic change, it's what happens with that change and how her positionality changes also with each section. So the first section is the vegetarian, and then Mongolian Mark, and then something flaming tree or something like that. And so each of these three movements seem to take the character into, even though it's an interiority of the people who are talking about her, her position changes in each three movements. And you kind of come away, or at least I came away as a reader, with a sense that she was more powerful than I think people might initially read it, that her determinism, even in, to hate to use Bartleby, the Scrivener, as an example, but this willfulness is also a power to make decisions for herself. And even though she experienced violence and manipulation in this book, you also see that she is determined to define herself in a way that is outside of the norms of her family dynamic. So I really enjoyed the book, really. What did you think, Laura?
Along the lines what you said, I think it's a 3-part novel where we're trying to understand or get to know the protagonist. And these people, these other characters, the brother-in-law and her sister and even her husband, they're in the way, I feel like, right? They're in my way of true. Like, I want to know this woman. I want to know what she's thinking, what she's feeling. Yep. And what we're getting is these mediated sort of interpretations of what she's thinking and feeling. And we might get sort of most direct, like, conversations and things like that in the last chapter, maybe, which arguably would be when her quote-unquote condition is most deteriorated out of the three, right? So it felt like how can I reach this person, this character, for me as a reader? And maybe that is sort of the beauty of the novel too. And as we mentioned earlier, talked about before, that the understanding also that the book in Korea apparently had been published in 3 parts as like individual novellas, each chapter that we see in the novel together. I think that's also like this journey to get to know this character, right, in 3 parts through these 3 other characters. So I'm so curious, like how Korean people, when it was published that way originally, how they experienced it. Yeah.
I think for me, so for context for our listeners out there, as Laura said, the book is written in 3 parts, and it's a very short. I think I read it in one sitting in the second go around. But it's a very, each of the 3 novellas kind of chunks it up. But interestingly, and I don't want to be too reductivist about the book, I think I'll call it like feminist, right? Intersectional feminist literature. But I would say that interestingly, like it's never told from her point of view, right? The protagonist, the main character. It's always told from, the first book or section is from her husband, who's just a terrible person. But it's really revealing. And I thought that was, at first I was like frustrated like you, like I want to hear from her, but I keep having these like narrators in my way. It's the husband, it's the brother-in-law, and then the sister who's, probably the closest to her that we can get. But then, I realized that's also kind of the genius of it, that the author manages to express so much of that determinism, that power, but it's never in her voice, it's always through just her resolute decisions. And it's not that big of a deal. There's plenty of vegetarians in Korea, right? Buddhism is like basically like it's all vegetarian cuisine, but so it isn't the choice that she makes to become a vegetarian in and of itself, but like what you were saying, like what that represents in terms of her self-determinism and not wanting to acquiesce or not. And it's I was reminded how calm she was during the whole thing, very intentional. And, it was really unnerving for her husband that it's like she woke up and she didn't have a meltdown and decide to become a veg. She just woke up and she keeps repeating this refrain, I had a dream.
Yeah.
Why did you do this? Because I had a dream.
Yeah.
And then it's just, she's very calm and very methodical about it,
Right.
And so, yeah.
I agree with that. I think it doesn't have to, for the theme to work or whatever we think the theme is, it doesn't have to be about becoming a vegetarian, but it is the primary specific that's in this novel. But, like you were talking about, Sylvia, when she just refuses do stuff that is supposed to be normal or expect societal expectations. Like one example is when she shows up at a function and she's not dressed properly, right? She's not wearing a bra or something. And then not only that, but not carrying on the conversation in this polite way that she's supposed to, right? With her husband's coworkers and things like that. And this refusal, and actually I think your reference to Bartleby is actually quite apt.
I know.
In that sort of quiet refusal, right?
Yes.
So I agree with that. I think it's not about being a vegetarian, but it's about doing things that are because she doesn't want to, right? I did want to say, I read this interesting article from PMLA about this translation thing, but I want to say something not about the translation, but about the content. And I read that a lot of the reaction or scholarly reaction to The Vegetarian was a reading of this novel in the school of the Mad Woman, right? Mad Woman feminist reading and sort of framing it around the French feminist theories. So, which seems so dated, like the book is published in 2007. It's a very Western framework to interpret a very Eastern work, right? Yeah. So I thought that was interesting to think about, when you said feminist, I definitely read it that way, but it gave me pause about the lens through which I'm understanding that feminism, right? Which is very different, I'm sure, in Korea today or Korea in 2007 when the book was published, or how Korean women experience feminism or not, right? So it was a good reminder through the article, like, oh, what are the frameworks we're using to understand the novel,
Yeah, I was about to say something that I didn't believe in, but what I'm going to say is that I think the idea of power dynamics, especially the way men in this novel exert their power, is, I think, the thing that's also being challenged subtly. And I think the protagonist, whose name I don't want to mess up. I think maybe she isn't the protagonist now that I think about it. But I'll say she's the protagonist. I think she's the object of their antagonism.
Interesting.
I think But I don't think she's the antagonist.
Right.
I think she becomes that object that isn't following norms or isn't demonstrating a kind of obedience to family structure. The fact that her father insists that he's her father, or, he has to be listened to, or he has to be the patriarch, if you will. And, the scene where he's forcing her to eat meat is, I think symbolic of that having the power over her as her father. And then she apparently has experienced some other kinds of abuse from him. It's later sort of revealed. I think that dynamic is also something that I think the novel is wrestling with. How do you maintain yourself within these power structures? How can you make determinations that are not based on the approval of other people outside of you?
That's right.
Yeah, and so I didn't read it in terms of feminists. I did look at it in terms of those kind of power dynamics, especially with the opening of the husband, how he describes her. So you're kind of a jerk.
He is. Well, I think that kind of goes back to what Laura was saying, and I was trying to actually post that to social media, to our page. But I think both of you guys kind of did it. I wish I could AI that.
into it, yeah.
Because I think that's exactly right. Because I think so much of how I have read about and learned about and understood feminism has come from a Western perspective on feminism that also takes, at the heart of it, power as well, right? Obviously. But the way that plays out in a Korean context is it's just different,
right.
And I don't think I've ever read anything that really kind of grapples with that to the extent that The Vegetarian did, which is why I think it stuck with me for a long time, because that power dynamic that you're talking about as it intersects with the idea of feminism and the rights that women have or don't have, so ingrained with family structures as part of it, and I would almost say even more so on the daily than the political structures in the country, although that certainly, it's all interconnected. It's the reason why I have a hate relationship with Confucius, right? Because so much of how Asians understand their family dynamic and their role within it it's not like the Western idea of this very hyper individualistic kind of my destiny, my path, and I'm independent, and your parents cut you off at 18, that kind of thing. You move out, you want to move out. It's not like that in a lot of Asian societies. It's you stick with your family unit, and in fact, for women, when you move out of your family unit, you're joining your husband's family unit, right? And this is kind of how their identities are defined. And so the fact that she would kind of not really, and she doesn't make it defiant, I'm not doing this anymore. It's just that I'm not eating meat. And, and the fact that Han Kang takes such a mundane decision and it shows how other people start freaking out about it, about the idea of them kind of ceding some of their power, to me was really fascinating how she put that together in such a powerful way. But
it's a general sort of fear of disorderliness, right, in among the other characters, right?
The whole family unit's gonna fall apart.
Yeah, and to that sort of violent reaction from her father is, and they keep emphasizing how, and I think I read about this the father's characterization in another article, but about how he is repeatedly described as a Vietnam veteran, right? And as a big guy who has fixed ideas or whatever. So I think that was kind of shocking to me. I was like, whoa, And within that context, the reaction seems so disproportionately, that it was very revealing about, it's not about that, right? It's not about the vegetarian, no.
Right.
It's about something else, something bigger, something, Yeah.
I think one of the things that we were all reacting to, and it struck me with this reading too, was normally I gravitate towards the way something is written, how sentences are constructed, words are put together. But this is a little bit different because this was a translated work.
Yeah.
And so you depend a lot on the translator to capture some of that artistic quality. One area I've always struggled with in reading, not just The Vegetarian, but all kind of translated works, especially in Korean, works that have been translated from the Korean, for me has been the dialogue. I feel that gap of translation most keenly when I read the dialogue, because it feels like a little bit forced. It feels a little bit, I'm always wondering, like, what am I missing out? If the story is this powerful as a story in and of itself and the moves that she's making, what else am I missing out in the way that this is put together and crafted on the sentence level? And we talked a little bit about translation, but I'm curious, Laura, you did quite some reading and there's some controversy about this.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of reading and I didn't realize that the controversy actually apparently kind of blew up the translation field, I guess. And there are lots of scholarly articles out there about it. But basically, the translator is Deborah Smith. And since then, she has translated 2 other novels by Han Kang. The author has stood by the translation despite all this controversy. And the gist of it is that a lot of the Korean scholars and Korean literature scholars and bilingual readers apparently have been critical of the translation, that they're ranging from differences or what they think is mistranslation of specific words, like nouns, all the way to things that the translator decides to leave out, right? Or keep in. So I think it's an interesting debate. And I don't know a whole lot about the scholarship of translation, but,
Mm-hmm.
they come down to apparently 2 schools. They're called
Originalists?
Yes, there you go. Versus the activist.
Okay.
And I think it's interesting that they're called that. And they're translating the idea, right, rather than maybe the language. And so I think there's different qualities to Korean language versus American English, right? So the translating not only culture, but also translating between 2 very different languages and how the languages are rhetorically, how they stand in for thoughts and ideas. So I thought that was interesting. But I wanted to just share one specific example because people had apparently issues with this. The very first sentence of the novel, and I think, Kofi, you were referring to this, is the husband, right, who says, "Before my wife turned vegetarian, I'd always thought of her as completely unremarkable in every way." In the Korean, rather than him saying that he thought of her that way, it actually says that he had never thought of her as being remarkable or special. Right? I think there's a difference in thinking that someone is unremarkable, which is what this translation is saying, versus I never thought of her as being special.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is, and I think the word special is closer to the word that's used in Korean, in my mind. So yes, it feels like a very, like 2 sides of the same coin, but they're 2 completely different sides.
He doesn't, the way it starts out in the English makes him, from the get-go, sound like a total jerk. You know, I'm like, I immediately am not going to like this guy.
Yeah.
But that, I never really thought there's anything that stood out about her in particular. It's not great, but it's less of a...
So here he's thinking of her.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like he's thinking of her. I thought of her.
Intentionally as unremarkable, and that's why I married her, is the impression I got.
That's right. But in the Korean, he just didn't think about her, is the impression we get. Like, I never thought of her as anything special, right? Like, and I think that I can understand why, I personally wouldn't say it's a wrong translation. I don't know if there is such a thing, but I would say, oh, those are 2 different things, right? And that's a choice that the translator has made.
Yeah, I would think special would, because in the novel they do make these references to being ordinary.
Yes.
And remarkable is a little bit beyond just special, I think, because it usually has a quality that someone could be special because they have green eyes. But that in and of itself doesn't make them remarkable. Remarkable because there are plenty of people with green eyes. So, when you think about something remarkable, you think about it as doing some kind of achievable thing that maybe no one else had done at the time. And being a vegetarian isn't that thing. It isn't even that special. But, it's a choice not to eat meat. That seems very, not as special, but the fact that he didn't think of her as being that way would make making that decision make her special. You see what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Yeah.
One is more active, I think, in that sense than the other. So that's interesting.
There's another one where he's describing I think the brother-in-law is describing her father. And he uses the word, something like apology and shame don't suit this man,
Yes.
this father, right? But in Korean, it's one word. It's not two different words. It's one word that I think it means being considerate. I don't know what the word being considerate, any other word for that. But like he is saying, oh, being considerate does not suit this, my father-in-law. And the translation is shame. And I don't know where the shame came from. She says shame and did I say the first word?
Apology.
Yeah, apology and shame combined. Like, does
Yeah.
that make consideration? No, I don't think so. No. So again, I'm not like judge like to the translation. I don't know, but those are different things, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
And yeah, you wonder if that would change the meaning or the tenor of the story.
Right.
Maybe not.
Right. Maybe not. Yeah.
But yeah, one of the things when I've read translations, I'm almost always thinking, I wonder what it would be like to read it in the actual, because I'm certain there's something they're missing. Yep. Because I think writers use not only the language of the sort of elevated language, but depending on the subject matter, they probably try to speak to that community in that language that they would use it as. I mean, I'm thinking about what would a translation of mumbo jumbo look like?
Yeah, it's true. Like idioms and sayings that don't really quite fit culturally.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the trickiest parts of translation.
Apparently among translators, there is a school of thought that running into sort of clunkiness in the language is part of the experience of reading a translated work, and that readers should expect some of that, right? And that it is on the reader. It's the reader's responsibility to pursue more understanding, maybe beyond what's in the book, to try to understand it. Like Kofi, like when you were wondering, I wonder what that says in the original, like to dig into that or to look that up or to try to understand that beyond the word choice that the translator has made. And I think that's an interesting philosophy, right? Like the reader has to do some of that work.
Well, also the work itself reminding the reader that it is a translated work, that you don't forget. Like I didn't forget while I was reading this that this has been translated. This wasn't like a Korean American author, a Korean author who's fluent in English writing it. It was very much, there are little signals, like I said, like the awkward dialogue, some of these phrases that I know don't quite fit. Always a reminder to me that this isn't my original form, right? The book saying, this isn't my original form. I exist in another form, which I thought was really interesting, considering even the content of what we're reading. So I think I could understand that, you know, like some awkwardness should be expected. And maybe, for you, like what you, to spur us to think like what you were thinking, Kofi, or what I was thinking, like, what am I missing out? Like, wonder what it sounds like in the actual language in which it was conceived. So yeah, I'm just going to read an excerpt from towards the end of the book where you begin to really see the full transformation. It's almost like transcendental in a way. The turn that the book takes from just the physical, like her being a part of her physical body, I'm talking about the protagonist who becomes a vegetarian, to almost this transformation into something else. And this is from the third part of the novel called Flaming Trees, which is kind of what she aspires to be, the protagonist ultimately. And this one is told from the point of view of her sister. And it's the first time a woman's voice is introduced into this. And when the sister begins to understand a little bit of what's happening and has that glimpse of like self-awareness. So her sister says, it's written from the sister's point of view, she'd been unable to forgive her for soaring alone over a boundary she herself could never bring herself to cross. Unable to forgive that magnificent irresponsibility that had enabled Young-hae, protagonist, to shuck off social constraints and leave her behind, still a prisoner. And before Young-hae had broken those bars, she'd never even known they were there. And to me, like the crux of the novel kind of like came together in that small realization. You don't really see that elsewhere. It's just a sort of grappling of why would she eat, what's happening, like her internally beginning to kind of transform herself for the first time, but nowhere near where her sister has become now. And so I thought this was and I'm gonna, wrap up the episode there, but I thought it was really interesting to kind of, consider this idea of a character who's not the main character having a revelation that's coming from the main character. It's just a really interesting kind of chain of events that she leaves us with basically towards the end of the novel. It's like pointing to you, the reader.
Yeah.
In conclusion,
I know.
like, that's, right? Like it's revelatory for us too.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I also like that scene or that moment, because it also reveals how challenging it is for people to understand when people break those bars or those barriers that seem equally arbitrary. You know, it wasn't like she was hunting down pilgrims or anything like crazy, but it was just exercising an ability that others could do. And I guess the handstanding and becoming a tree was one of those other moments. There were some funny moments.
Yeah, there were some pretty hilarious.
Yeah, there were some things that was kind of funny. But we are at the conclusion of our wonderful, wonderful podcast. Thank you for listening and joining us. And we will be back in January-ish or closer to February. And we hope that you've enjoyed what we've done this past semester. Tune in, and you can tune in at any of the places you get your podcast: Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, if you so choose. And join us again for Bookish, a casual book club.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Dragon Podcasts. Connect with us at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.